Okay, I think we're set except for my webcam. Do that real quick so you can see my pretty face. I'm sure everybody really cares about that. It makes me seem more present, doesn't it? Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing good. Were there any questions or concerns? We did get but because of the technical issues last week, yeah, you'll catch up. Worried about that unless you are. Everybody good? All right. Okay. See somebody typing. I'll wait just a second. Quizzes, exams coming up. It should just say it in Canvas. I believe there. I forget if there's a quiz right now or not. I mean, there's certainly no final or rather, there's no midterm or anything big like that. The quizzes and other things like that, they sort of depend on the week. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, Catherine, but if you just look in Canvas, it's pretty easy. All right, I'll do it really quick, just to double check here.
Your mic's dropping.
Somebody said something. Okay, yeah, there is a quiz. There is a quiz that initially was going to be. Oh man, that's crazy. I was just covering this this lamp because it was too bright, but I covered it with a book. Look what happened. Good thing I took it off. It started burning. I'm cutting out. So am I still cutting out? Is that happening? Let me turn it up. Dial in my stuff here. Here, is that better? Is this more normal? Did that fix it at all? It's better, okay. Because I turned it down a little bit because on the videos it was overdriving a little bit. I had too much sound going in, so I turned it way down. Maybe I turned it down too much, and I turned the compression up higher. Okay, does this sound pretty normal? Or do you want it up more? I can certainly turn it up more. It's good? Okay, cool. Cool. Okay, so yeah, there is a quiz this week, and it's going to be on stuff that we're going to cover today and on Thursday. So you might want to wait to take it. So that's all that there is right now. You got a lot of, there's all sorts of reading you can do. And hopefully you're watching the videos. And if you're not, if you're not sure what's going on, then you just go through these prezzies themselves, right? The presentations that I talk about in the class. You can always go over those, do the reading in the textbook. But right now it got a little bit. We don't have a whole lot going on because we sort of almost went through that last week without doing a whole lot. But it's okay. There's a lot of stuff to digest as well. So apart from that, yeah, just keep an eye out for that quiz, okay? And pay attention because some of this stuff might be tricky, right? So we were at Descartes, all right? This is where we ended up. I'm going to try to go through it kind of fast because we do have a little bit of catching up to do. A lot of the really good stuff in Descartes we've sort of done, right? The kind of fun stuff is going through these thought experiments. And yes, thank you. Let's double check here. Did I press record? Yes, I did. Thank you. Good reminding me because I wasn't sure for a second. Always remind me. Thank you. So what we did is we saw what Descartes was trying to do, right? His overall project was to find some sort of solid foundation of knowledge to build on, okay? But he's going to use a technique, a method to get there, and he's going to use skeptical arguments. The thing that I keep saying is tricky is that Descartes himself is not a skeptic, and at the end of the day, he wants you to reject those arguments when he's all through. But all we've done so far is doing those exercises, just sort of what if, for the sake of argument, let's suppose maybe you're dreaming, can you really know anything based on the senses then? Or what if it's possible that there's an evil scientist who stole your brain and put it in a vat and is now feeding you some sort of virtual experience? Can you rule out those sorts of possibilities? And you could make the case, right, as the skeptical arguments do, is that if you cannot trust your sensory experience, then you certainly don't know anything about the external world around you, and that includes even your own body, right? Now I'm saying body specifically. I'm not saying you, because Descartes' going to want to say that you as a person, that's the one thing you know exists. But your body, you only know about your body through your senses, right? So your own body, your own face, your own hands, they're in just as much doubt as the chair you're sitting on and your entire surroundings. Because all of that, you could be having those experiences even though they're not real, even though you don't really have that body, you're just a brain in a vat, or perhaps you are just an immaterial soul being deceived by some sort of demon. Those are all logical possibilities. You can conceive that that's the case, even though there's no way for you to find out. And so that seems to destroy knowledge. It seems to destroy the possibility, at least, of having empirical knowledge of the world around you. And the same goes for mathematical truths, what we've been calling a priori truths, as opposed to a posteriori truths. A priori truths, things that you know primarily just by thinking. You don't even have to check the external world, right? So 2 + 2 = 4, you can know that a priori, it doesn't matter if you're in a dream or not, right? That's something that you can hold to be true. But Descartes suggests, well, even that, if you imagine a crazy enough possibility, even that's problematic, right? So again, say there's an evil scientist who knows how to manipulate your psychology so that you assent to things that are not true at all, and they are things like mathematical things, like 2 + 2 = 5, and this being somehow is able to manipulate your brain or your mind into thinking that it's true when it's actually not. So that's where we left off, right? So it destroys all kinds of knowledge. So we're trying to clear out all the stuff that is even remotely doubtable, to get to some sort of solid foundation so that we can then build back up again and hopefully get all those beliefs back, all that a priori knowledge, all that a posteriori knowledge, at least get all the good ones back, right? That's going to be the point of it. So all these two things to keep in mind. Descartes is guiding you through this meditation. Right? He's guiding you. Yeah, it's a guided meditation in a sense, right? He's guiding you through this whole experience of getting you to doubt all your most fundamental beliefs until you get to something that's so solid that you cannot doubt it. Right? And that solid thing is yourself as a consciousness, right? As a thinking being. Descartes talks about thought and thinking. That's his word to denote all the mental stuff you can do. Sometimes I prefer just to say your consciousness, your conscious states, right? So that no matter what's happening out there in the external world, you do know that you as a consciousness exists who is having various different experiences, right? And so you can know that, at least. You can know that you exist as an experiencing conscious being. Even if you don't know if your experiences refer to anything real out there, or if it's just a binary code being fed to you by a computer, or a magic spell by a demon, whatever your favorite way of imagining these skeptical possibilities, no matter what skeptical possibilities there are, you know that at the very least you exist. Right? I think, therefore I am. Here I am having conscious experiences. I don't know if they're a dream or real or an evil genius scenario, a brain in a vat, the Matrix. I don't know, but at least I know that here I am having experiences. How can you doubt that? Right? You just can't. It makes no sense, because to doubt, you have to be there to do the doubting. That's the argument. I have suggested that that's a little problematic, because Descartes had already said that we are allowing for the possibility that some evil being or whatever it may be can manipulate your psychology into believing that you're thinking logically and reasonably even though you're not. So how can we even trust this part, right? It's a famous problematic aspect of what Descartes is doing. He wants to get to that solid foundation in order to build on it, but many people have suggested, or at least struggled with the concept, the idea that once you introduce these skeptical scenarios, there's actually no way to get out of them. There just isn't, right? And that's why some people are just skeptics. They think, yeah, the arguments are right. You don't know a damn thing, right? Because you can't reason your way out of it. Once you've doubted your own capacity for reasoning, then you've sort of pulled the rug out from under yourself, haven't you? There's no way that you can trust yourself to reason towards any truth at all then. Right? So I'm saying this as a potential problem for Descartes. That's not what he was thinking. He was hoping that this would work, that, well, you can cast doubt on all sorts of beliefs and it makes sense, but this is bottom line. Now we've hit the bottom. You must exist as a thinking being, right? Which does sound kind of right, doesn't it? I mean, if you don't think about some evil genius manipulating your psychology, but you're just thinking about your experiences and the possibility that it's all a dream and the possibility that you're in a matrix. It's true, when you're contemplating all these different possibilities, the one thing that's remaining the same is you. You are there in each of these possible scenarios, that you're the one that's thinking about it. So you must exist, and you're at least having these experiences, whether or not they're veridical, right? Veridical meaning they accurately represent reality, right? So say you're looking at trusty old coffee mug, right? You think that it's there because you see it. You think it's really there in external reality. Well, all these scenarios, all these skeptical scenarios cast doubt on that, right? For all you know, this does not really exist. It's just a bunch of zeros and ones in a virtual reality program, right? For all you know, this thing is not real. But the crucial thing that Descartes is going to say, you are at least having an experience of a cup, aren't you? You cannot doubt that you are there having an experience of the cup, even if your experience of the cup is not veridical, even if there is no cup out there to correspond to your experience. At least you're there having those experiences. So that's his bedrock truth, right? That's where he can finally settle. Now we're done doubting everything. Okay, now we're done with that. We're done with methodological doubts. We've gotten to where we need to get for Descartes, which is this unshakable foundation of the cogito, right? The thinking self that must exist whenever it is contemplating its own existence or anything out there at all. Whenever it's there contemplating, by definition, there it is contemplating. That's what you are. You are a contemplating, thinking, conscious being, essentially. And again, not a body, essentially, for Descartes. A body is something you can doubt the existence of. Your conscious self is something you cannot doubt. So Descartes argues there must be two different things. This is a classic argument for dualism in general, but you see how it fits perfectly within Descartes' overall schema here, his overall project. It's very interesting that all these kind of ideas just sort of fall out of it just by doing this skeptical exercise, right? So basically, remember, right, skeptics are real people. Descartes was arguing against them. He wants to not be a skeptic. He wants to know all sorts of stuff. And he wants to know religious truths. Because remember, religious truths were also under attack by a lot of skepticism and this new science that seemed to reveal a different kind of world when you use its methods. So he's trying to address religious skepticism as well. So here he is using skepticism to show that you must exist as an immaterial being, right? It's kind of neat. He's showing that souls are real, right? Immortal souls. That's a very religious idea. And notice how this idea of an immortal soul comes out of this project of casting doubt on everything. So he's using skeptical arguments, but in order to arrive at a truth, right, rather than at trying to ultimately undermine everything. And the next step builds on that. It's again trying to come up with something certain, and again of a religious nature, this is where Descartes loses a lot of people, okay? Because you pretty much just have to already be someone who believes in the traditional God. Because he's going to present an argument for why he thinks God must exist, which I'll give you in a second. But that argument is not really convincing to anyone who doesn't already believe that God exists. So it's a bit of a problematic part of the Meditations. But you could, if you are not someone who believes in the traditional God, you could at least put yourself in Descartes' mindset, right? So you understand, right? Many theists, right? A theist is a person who believes that God exists. Many theists are very confident that they can simply know that God is real. They sort of intuit it directly, the same way that you can intuit directly that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Or that you exist as a conscious being, right? This sort of a priori, intuitive grasping of a truth, right? This sort of Platonic thing. That's many religious believers explain their own beliefs in that way, is that it's not something that they're reasoning their way towards or basing on empirical evidence. It's simply something that they just know is true directly. So Descartes is pretty close to that. He does present 2 different arguments for why this being must be real. I'll focus on just one, the one that's easier to understand. The other one is interesting too, but it's sort of a moot point. Like I said, everyone who is most people who are not already God believers will not be convinced by these arguments, okay? And many people who do believe in God might not be convinced by these arguments either. You might have other reasons to believe that God exists apart from Descartes. But this is what Descartes is thinking, right? So he's thinking, okay, here I am. All I know right now is that I'm a conscious being. I've got a mind with thoughts. Okay, let me look within myself for clues then. I can't look at the outside world yet. I don't have that back yet. That's still sort of bracketed, as it were, right? We haven't been able to say yet, oh, the external world is real and this is not a dream. We're not quite there yet. We're just at that moment where you can say, I know I exist as a conscious being. I know I've got all these thoughts and ideas, right? Whether they're real or not. Well, Descartes thinks that one of the ideas that he has in his mind is this idea of a perfect being. A perfect being. Descartes thinks that he can really grasp this idea with complete clarity and certainty. And he reasons that since I can conceive of a perfect being, then I have to ask, well, does this being that I thought of, does this exist just in my head? Or does it really exist out there in reality? Well, he reasons, a perfect being would have to have a necessary existence. It can't be what's called contingent. A contingent being is a being like you and me. We might have never existed, right? If something else had been different, we wouldn't have existed. If our parents hadn't met, we wouldn't exist, right? Things like that. Or if the earth had been destroyed 100 years ago, we wouldn't exist. There's all these possibilities. We are contingent beings, but a perfect being can't be like that. A perfect being can't be the thing that might exist or might not exist. A perfect being would have necessary existence, says Descartes. Necessary existence means existing in all possible worlds, so that it's logically impossible for a perfect being to not exist. So he concludes a perfect being, which really just means God, right? So even in a traditional Catholic understanding of God, God is defined as the ultimate, a perfect being, right? Just the apotheosis of perfection, the standard for everything, right? The highest you can get. This same sort of idea as the form of the good in Plato, right? It's at the very top. It's the most pure, the most real thing that exists, the most perfect thing. So Descartes reasons that, therefore, this is not just an idea in my mind. If it was just an idea in my mind, it wouldn't actually be perfect. Tricky argument. And this is relying on an older argument by a Catholic theologian named Saint Anselm. Okay? So he did not come up with this argument, but it's sort of like this. Like you could say something, I could rule out the possibility of a married bachelor, right? Are there any married bachelors? No, right? By definition, right? You can't have a married bachelor. That's not a bachelor. Can you have a four-sided triangle? No, no, no. The concept of triangle includes, right? We talked about this. It's a necessary condition is that it has just three sides. To say that something is a four-sided triangle is just nonsense, right? It's a self-contradictory statement. I am suggesting that Descartes or Anselm's arguments for God is similar to that. They would say that a non-existent God is a self-contradiction because the concept of God includes perfection and therefore necessary existence. That's part of the concept of God. Just like you've got the concept of a bachelor, part of that is that they're unmarried. Right? So then when you say they're married, you're contradicting the concept. And when you say a triangle is four-sided, you're contradicting the very concept that you're talking about. And so to say that God maybe doesn't exist is to contradict the concept of God, because the concept of God includes necessary existence. Weird, right? What do we think of this argument? It's weird because it's hard to really show why it's wrong, and yet at the same time, most people get the intuition that it can't quite be right. Yeah. And I think we will talk about this argument more later on when we do the existence of God in the philosophy of religion, right? Right now, just putting it out there, Descartes thinks this is a good argument, and like I said, he's got another argument as well. So he thinks that it's just possible to prove a priori, right, that this being must exist by intuiting a simple truth that you can grasp intellectually and then thinking about it deductively and seeing what follows. Just like doing math, right? Just going right back to Plato, who was impressed by the mathematicians. It's going back to Euclid, who starts with certain geometrical things that you can intuit directly, and then you sort of deduce the whole geometric system from that. Descartes trying to do the same thing here, starting with certain basic elemental truths like I exist, and then drawing out of that the fact that God exists. Right? He thinks he can show this all sort of deductively, a priori. And so now, of course, it gets a little bit easier going, right? Now, once we've accepted this, and let's just do that for the sake of argument. Let's suppose that Descartes has now successfully shown that God must exist. And of course, this would have to be a perfect God. And so that would include all the traditional attributes of perfection, like being omniscient, right? Knowing everything, being omnipotent, being all powerful, being omnibenevolent, being all good, right? This is very important. This is just part of Christian theology, that if God is a perfect being, that includes perfect goodness, right? Perfect benevolence, perfect moral goodness, right? God is a perfectly just being. Now, since that's part of the definition of God, and we've proven that by definition God must exist, then we can conclude that God is not a deceiver. Right? God wouldn't let us be deceived all the time in a systematic way. So in other words, God would make sure that there's not an evil demon constantly messing with us. Right? A good God would not allow that. God is not a deceiver. This is also problematic, as we'll see when we get to philosophy of religion, because as it turns out, once you talk about the problem of evil with relation to God, right? Once you point out all the suffering that exists in the world, once you point out that children drown all the time, and God doesn't actually intervene to do anything, then a religious believer will have to say something like, well, we're not really in a position to say what God ought to do. That's not up to us to decide if God ought to save those drowning children. He probably has a good reason for not doing it. Of course, once you say that we can't make these kinds of judgments about God, you'd have to apply that here as well, right? How would you know that God doesn't employ systematic deception in order to get some greater good out of it, right? In the same way that theists come up with some sort of justification for why children drown, in the same way there might be some sort of justification for why God allows us to be deceived in a systematic way. But that's not what Descartes thinks. Descartes thinks that that's pretty clear, that if God is really sovereign, if God is really this conscious mind with a will and an intelligence who cares about his creation, then he will not allow human beings to be systematically deceived in that way. Because if he did, he would be a kind of a liar, and that's not a morally good trait, to be a deceiver. So he thinks God would just not allow that. And so that also means that you don't really have to worry about dreaming either. You don't have to worry about any kind of systematic deception about all of life, right? That doesn't mean you can't ever be deceived or go wrong. It just means that these very skeptical scenarios that we were contemplating are now ruled out. Yeah, now do you see what I meant when I said Descartes wants you to use these exercises to get to a certain place, but then he wants to disavow the strength of those arguments. Now he wants to say, look, once we've got God secure, once we know that God exists and we know God's nature as a benevolent being, then we know that we're not being systematically deceived in that way. You see how it works?
But can I ask a question?
Yeah.
But it seems like he just uses this to move on.
Right.
You know, so it's this cheap way, and if I read Ford or whatever, it seems like a lot of these guys use the same way just to. I need to move on. Like he says at the end of meditation 1, I'm just going to sit here. I got to go to bed because I can't move on.
Yeah.
So the next day he's like, dude, I got to start. Like, it would be a million meditations if it wasn't for this one fact that he can build off of.
Yeah, there's something just to be said for that. Now, I do think like the sort of like the moving on and the meditations, you know, he thought of this all ahead of time.
Right,
he's
right,
sort of
but
like
it's
doing it as
right.
though he's thinking through it. But he's sort of, it's all premeditated. Premeditated, it works perfect, right? It's a meditation that's been premeditated. But as far as this specific thing, that he would be stuck if it weren't for this. I think you're right. And this is a nice luxury that theistic believers have, right? If you already believe in God, that's sort of a luxury, and we'll see this come up in other contexts as well, that God can sort of just be the solution to any kind of intellectual problem, right?
Right,
Yeah.
but you have good God, bad God, but there's no ambivalent God in his will.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, that's the problem I have with it.
Yeah, when I say that last part again, sort of cut out.
But it's the problem I have is there's no ambivalent God to him. It's either bad or good. My camera's, I think it's my internet.
You're still cutting out a bit. You're saying there's no way that it's just bad or good?
No ambivalent God.
Sorry, it's still cutting out. Maybe you can type
There
in
we go.
something. Oh, your video actually cut out too. I want to know what you were saying, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you're raising.
I meant, yeah, I'll type it. Give me a sec.
Okay. Yeah, but lots of philosophers who study Descartes have a real problem with this move. But to appreciate it, you have to really put yourself in the mind of someone like Descartes, who, for one, is a committed Christian who really believes in God. And you know, religious belief often comes with a kind of certainty, a feeling of certainty. Not all religious believers are like that, but that is often the case. So imagine Descartes as someone, just a regular religious believer who tends to believe that their thing, what they believe, is the truth, the correct thing. Right? Really believe it sort of dogmatically. But then add to that Descartes is also a rationalist who thinks that it's perfectly conceivable that you can simply think about something and know that it is true. Right? That you can know that 2 + 2 = 4. That's true. It's actually hard to prove that 2 + 2 = 4 in a mathematically rigid way, right? Or everything is identical with itself, right? It's one of those statements that you can simply intuit directly, know that it is true, right? Or other things that we talked about when we talked about Plato. right? A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared. Once you understand what that means, you know that it is true. And so Descartes just thinks that God belief is the same sort of thing. That it's not something you necessarily have to build a case for. You might have to do a little bit of deductive reasoning, but for the most part, it's just simply a truth that you can intuitively grasp. Right? So it's sort of, axioms that you don't prove them, right? The axioms of Euclid, the idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. It's not actually something how would you go about proving it? You just get it or you don't, right? You can't really prove it. It's an intuitive truth that you simply see must be true. Descartes thinks God belief is the same sort of thing. That when it gets down to it, it's really just one of these things that has to be true, like A equals A, 1 plus 1 equals 2, everything's identical with itself, God exists, right? So there's lots of things to think about. One is, can you really know anything a priori at all in the way that rationalists talk about? If so, is God really one of those? All sorts of stuff to think about there. So yeah, so for most people, that's going to look like a huge reach. Of course, it's a good thing to keep in mind that what is and isn't a reach depends very much on your background knowledge and your background information and your a lot of which you acquired through your culture. This is why we get postmodern responses to the modern era to things like Descartes, right? Descartes is assuming this thing that he just knows intuitively a priori, but it's actually a cultural artifact of living in a highly Catholic society. And if he had lived somewhere else, he might have never had that idea. So it's a huge reach to us, but it depends on your background information. So for Descartes, it does not seem like a huge reach because everyone he's talking to mostly believes in God already anyway. So he just doesn't think that that's something you really have to prove, even though he does provide these arguments. But his arguments are mostly just, hey, look, you can intuit this directly. You can know that this is true simply by thinking about it. But this is definitely, many people, I would say, throughout the ages, philosophers looking back on Descartes do have a problem with this. And it's the same problem as before, Descartes is using reasoning here. Right? He's trusting his own reasoning to be able to conclude all sorts of things, that God exists, that God is not a deceiver, right? That God has given me this capacity to reason. But he's using reason to do that. So yeah, it's what's called the Cartesian circle, because it sort of seems to go around in a circle. He has to prove that you can actually use deductive reasoning because it's already been cast in doubt. Doubt has been casted on this idea that you can use reasoning because someone might be manipulating your psychology. But then he's relying on it before he even got to God, and God is supposed to make sure that that's not happening, right? But he's relying on reasoning already. He's relying on deductive a priori reasoning to get to God, and then to get to we're not being systematically misled. So really, there's two problems, right? There's the problem of he's using reasoning, which he had sort of cut himself off from. And he's relying on this idea of a God being this necessary truth that everyone can just grasp. Both of those things have been thought of as problematic, to say the least. But there's also responses that people can give, right? So you've got Cartesian scholars and theists who have all sorts of interesting things to say. So this is just the beginning of thinking about all this stuff, right? I'm not giving a final verdict on it. But the idea is, this is what he reasons himself towards. If God really is this benevolent being who created human beings and he wants what's best for us because he's good, and God has given us this capacity to reason, so really that means that we are able to come to know the truth about the world, both about geometry and math and the world around us. But we have to do this in the right way. Right? And this is where the methodology part of it all comes in, right? This is where we see this is the beginning of science in many ways, right? It's the beginning of the scientific revolution, thinking about how to do epistemology, right? How to get knowledge properly. Remember, epistemology is about how to get knowledge about the world, whether it's a priori or a posteriori knowledge. Descartes is saying, well, here's what we ought to do. Like, you can make mistakes, but a lot of times when you make mistakes, you're not really grasping something as clearly as you ought to, right? That's why math is such a good example, because you can clear what he calls clearly and distinctly, right? Can't you just, it's so crystal clear to you that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's a very clear idea, isn't it? You can show what it means with different objects, and it's a very, what he would call a distinct idea, because it's not, you're not getting 2 plus 2 equals 4 confused with 3 plus 3 equals 6. It's a completely different idea. You can clearly and distinctly understand that. And Descartes is saying that's what knowledge ought to be like. Right? If something isn't clear and distinct in that way, then it's just not knowledge. And so you should avoid saying that it's true, right? So that way you will not be misled. You can make a mistake still, right? So God is not systematically deceiving you, but God has given you free will, right? It's sort of a free will defense here. God is giving you free will to use your reasoning skills or not. So if you make mistakes, or if you're systematically misled about the nature of reality, that's just because you are assenting to claims that you don't know, that you are saying you know things even though you can't clearly and distinctly see that they are true, right? Even though you can't deductively show that it must be true or anything like that. So it's still possible for you to make mistakes, but God has given us the ability to sort through our sensory information, sort through our ideas about numbers and shapes and things like that, and then we have the ability to come to truth. Right? But you shouldn't say about anything that you know that it is true unless it has that kind of weight to it, the way in which you know that right-sided triangles must follow the Pythagorean theorem, the way that you know that 2 plus 2 must equal 4. When you have that kind of clear and distinct knowledge, just kind of certain, crystal clear, right? No vague boundaries between things, right? You can't have any of that. Everything has to be well defined and categorized correctly. Then you've got some sort of knowledge. And that makes sense because science proceeds in that way, right? Science has a harder time with not well-defined variables, right? They need to be very well-defined. It needs to be crystal clear. We need to know exactly what kind of measurements will be relevant to our theory, all this kind of stuff. So Descartes, in thinking about all this, right, he's gone through this whole meditation, and now he's at this point where he thinks, well, God must have set it up in a fair way. He must have given us the ability to know the truth. What is that ability? It's reason. It's our ability to reason. It's the light of reason shows what everything is like. Right? Remember the lights of the form of the good? Light is an important metaphor in rationalism. We often find that when everything is clear, right? Clear and distinct because it's being lit up so you can clearly see something. So your reason allows you to do that with things like numbers. You can clearly see that 1 plus 1 equals 2. You can clearly get that. So that's the standard for knowledge. So basically it means that for human beings, knowledge is possible, and moving on, Descartes says, let's leave the past behind and all its bad methodologies. Let's use scientific reason to discover the truth about everything. So it was a very optimistic vision of what science and reason can do. Very optimistic, because it means that all human beings, we just have a capacity to know the truth about the world around us just by doing that, just by reasoning about it, because that's the way that God set it up. Very optimistic. But of course, you fast forward to now, and we see that even though we try to do that, there's so much stuff that we still don't really quite get. And so this optimistic dream of, well, we can just discover everything about the nature of reality by this God-given ability turned out to not be entirely correct. So that's another postmodern problem that people have with the modern era, right? A postmodernist critique of Descartes would be something like that. Descartes, you're being way too optimistic about what reason can get us as human beings. For one, human beings, it turns out, through studying psychology and stuff like that, it turns out we don't look like we're these perfect knowledge machines that can gather knowledge objectively without bias, simply by using our God-given ability to reason. There's all sorts of stuff happening in our brains that just make us too finite to really be so certain that we've got it all figured out simply because we use reason. Okay, that was a little bit of a digression, but I like to sometimes think about the modern era, right? What we call the modern era, and then postmodern era. Some of the critiques that postmodernists have of modernism. I used to be very unsympathetic towards postmodernism. I used to just think it was a bunch of garbage for other reasons. But I kind of get some of the critiques. So you don't necessarily have to say that reason is stupid or bad or that doesn't help. Obviously, look at what science did. We figured out lots of stuff because people like Descartes said, look, we need to get more mathematical about this. We need to get more systematic about science. We need to do all this stuff to really clearly understand what we're talking about. That's a good thing, and it had good results, but his optimism was a little bit too big, maybe. He had too much optimism about how much we could really know. Because look, Descartes was seeing it a little bit like the way a lot of theists see it, that life is kind of a video game that God has set up for us. And the point is that we have the ability to do the things that we want to do, like gather knowledge. That we can really do that. We're set up for that, right? Through our senses and mostly through our reasoning. But modern psychology and evolution and things like that really cast doubts on our ability to do that as well as Descartes thought we would be able to. Okay. So yeah, we each experience a subjective representation of reality, but to really know what the objective truth is about the world out there, you have to use reason, and you have to use some sort of scientific methodology, which Descartes only goes on to describe to a certain extent. Methodology in science itself developed over time, right? Different methodologies that developed over time. So it's not as though Descartes simply invented the entire scientific method. He's getting the ball rolling. Okay, so we end up with this kind of picture. I said I was going to try to do this quickly. I guess you cannot do Descartes quickly to do him justice. We get this kind of picture, right? We got two independent substances. The world divides into two different kinds of things, right? Minds and bodies. Because remember, a mind is different from a body because a mind is something that you cannot doubt. Whereas bodies, you can doubt. All right, so supposedly human beings are like that. We have these immaterial conscious minds that can exist without a body, but while we're alive in the world, we are somehow latched onto this physical body. And now, of course, because God is being brought into the picture, Descartes will say, you don't have to doubt the existence of your body anymore. Okay, your body exists, that's fine. But what kind of knowledge can you have about your body or the things around you? That's going to depend on, your ability to reason, basically. It's going to use on your rational mind. And you have to make sure that you're doing things scientifically, right? And so you have these two different things, minds and bodies. A mind is defined by its ability to think, what Descartes calls thinking, but what Descartes calls thinking really includes all these mental capacities that you have. The ability to be conscious, to have perceptions, the ability to think and reason. Those are all defining attributes of the mind, right? So you can have things like emotions, you can believe things, you can desire things, you can have sensations, you can want something or will something. And notice all those things are directly accessible to you, even if the external world is an illusion, right? Even if that were the case, right? You would still know when you're feeling anger, or you'd still know that you believe something or that you want something, right? So those things are not subject to doubt. Your own internal states are immediately apparent to you, not to anyone else, but to you. right? You know what mental state you're in right now, according to this idea. Whereas bodies are defined by their extension in space. So the stuff around you, the natural world, now this is very important because this sets up the scientific revolution, right? Because before this, people had an Aristotelian kind of mindset, like Aristotle, right? Aristotle was someone who was a direct realist. He thought there's stuff out there in the world and it has certain properties, and that sort of impinges on our mind. So the redness of an apple, for example, the apple is essentially red, and that redness somehow goes into our mind, and then we have the redness in our minds. Notice that we get a different picture here, right? The essence of a body is to be extended in space. So it's got a location somewhere, it has a certain size, a certain shape, it might be moving or at rest, it might have a certain mass or weight. But color is an experience. That's in your mind, right? Brought on by photons. Photons are the real things out there, or light waves, however you want to describe it, right? You can sort of describe it either way. I love thinking about photons as like little balls that are constantly bouncing off of surfaces everywhere, and they're shooting into your eyeballs and creating a certain pattern in the back of your eyeball, and your brain then reconfigures that into the experience of color, right? So this scientific view takes certain subjective things out of our picture of the world. Things like color, things like taste, smell, even sound are completely subjective. You only experience those things. Without the experience, there would be no red, right? There's no red out there. There's just light waves. And so the world, the objective world, is colorless. So this is one of those examples where you're confused, right? This is not a clear and distinct idea. If you think that, for example, your hand objectively has a color, the color that you experience. No, the color that you experience in your hand, this sort of pinkness, right, is completely in your experience. Out here, there's just a physical extended surface that has a certain surface pattern that allows for the dispersion of light waves in particular patterns that then register in your mind as pinkness. But there is no pinkness in the world out there. Right? This is one of the ways in which these early philosophers and scientists were trying to get those subjective elements out of it, those mind-dependent elements out of it. We want to get at this objective world out there, the world of physical bodies. That's what science is about. I hope we see that how that works. Galileo, before Descartes, was one of the first people to suggest this, to get away from this direct realism that they inherited from Aristotle. The idea that color and smell are somehow out there in the world. No. What's out there in the world are little particles, little extended things that move around, right? And the way that they impinge on your organs, on your eardrums, right? There's a physical thing there. You've got eardrums. What's drumming on those ears? Sound waves, right? Sound waves are bombarding those drums. And what you're getting is, you're getting a frequency, you're getting a pattern that exists out there, but as a purely physical thing. There's no real sound out there in the world. The sound is completely in your mind, right? There is something out there, sound waves, but sound waves, again, are these extended things. The sound that you hear is something purely psychological and mental. It doesn't exist out there in the world, right? So if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to hear it, does it make a sound? No, according to this view. Not really. It creates sound waves, what we call sound waves, and if a person was standing near those sound waves, then that would give rise to a subjective experience. Right? Of course, we know that if there's another person standing over there, their subjective experience is going to be slightly different from mine. That's because we are subjective, right? We are in these specific positions in space and time with our particular sensory organs and how well they function or don't function. That's all subjective. The thing out there remains the same. Right? The same as with the dress, right? What color is the dress? Objectively, there's only one kind of light waves that are being reflected off that dress or off your computer screen if you're looking at that dress. I hope everyone knows about the dress. What color does the dress look? Well, the way it looks is completely here subjective. The thing that's actually objectively true is what sort of light wave dispersion it has, however we want to talk about the science of it, right? It has a certain reflective capacity for dispersing light waves and photons in such a way that in some people it induces this color experience, and in some people it induces this other color experience. The color experience is subjective and in your mind. The objective world out there is one that is purely defined in terms of extension in space and these other spatial properties that have to do with movement and size and mass and weight and things like that. These measurable, objectively measurable things that exist objectively out there in the world, not just in your head. Right? So by separating these two worlds, so not only is he helping out or trying to help out this clash between the church and science by showing, you know, the left side of this thing that I have up here, that's more of the spiritual theological realm, but over here we've got this scientific realm. And by defining it so specifically as being about the physical world and whose nature is to be extended, we've narrowed down the scope of what science is about in a fundamental way. And you might challenge that, and people have challenged that, but certainly the early history of science is very dependent on this idea that we have to get rid of these subjective elements and focus only on these objective things that we can actually measure. But notice you are effectively cutting off a whole area from scientific inquiry if you do that. Right? This whole idea of feeling a pain, for example, right? That pain then would be a completely subjective thing that's just in my mind. Would there be any way to study that scientifically? Well, in a way, if you think that this is right, then you can't. You can't study the mind scientifically if it's defined in such a way that it's not amenable to scientific investigation. Right? So lots of things to think about. Let's see. Okay, yes. Yeah, so that was about it for Descartes. Lots of things to chew on, right? You know, maybe of most importance for what we're going to do next after we're done with this history section is his philosophy of mind, right? His dualism, the idea that human beings are a composite of a physical body and an immaterial soul that is defined by its consciousness and its ability to reason and think and experience. We'll revisit that, right? That's one of the most important things, and we'll revisit that when we do philosophy of mind. For now, yeah. So keep his dualism in mind. These skeptical scenarios. I mean, forget about what Descartes does with them, right? You think about it on your own. How weird are those scenarios? What do you do about them? Descartes was able to say, well, God wouldn't allow that to happen all the time. Right? What's your solution to these skeptical scenarios? Right? Most people's solution is, it doesn't really have much of a practical effect on my everyday life. Even if it were true, I would still just continue to live my life as I've been living it because it seems pretty, seems like a pretty consistent set of experiences. Yeah, so some people just shrug it off. That sort of makes sense. But just as a purely theoretical, philosophical problem, it is interesting, right? Because saying that it's not practically applicable is not the same as actually solving the problem. It's rather saying, I don't need to worry about this, which maybe you don't. But that does not. Don't make that fool you into thinking that the problem is thereby solved. You haven't actually solved these skeptical problems yet by just saying that they're not practical. But at the end of the day, maybe that's the only thing we can do, right? So leave that up to you. So contemplate skepticism, whether or not you think there's ways to get out of these skeptical scenarios. And if there's not, what does that mean? Right? These are all things that you can think about, food for thought. And you could think about that completely separate from Descartes' project. Skepticism is a general philosophical problem. So think about that. Think about his dualism, and think about this this idea of setting science on some sort of firm foundation with a particular methodology, right? So Descartes is saying we need to just study the world of physical objects in terms of their mass and size and location and things like that, and that's exactly what subsequent scientists did, right? Newton's worldview, Newton's mechanics, Newton's physics is completely like that. It's completely Cartesian in that sense. Now, there's other things he disagreed with Descartes about, but it is this idea of, well, there's these objects in time and space, and we can measure them and come up with mathematical formulas that match what we see in the world, that will allow us to predict all sorts of things. It'll allow us to predict the trajectory of some sort of projectile over time, things like that, by purely focusing on this objective world of extended things. Okay. And again, quick reminder that, of course, on this definition, if a ghost ever does manifest itself, if you're a ghost believer and you see a ghost in some sense, right? Maybe you don't see a white sheet or even a complete person. Maybe you think you see some sort of sparkly energy or something like that. If that's the case, that would be part of the physical world on this view, wouldn't it? It would not be an immaterial soul because you can't see those. Okay? If you saw a ghost and you're using Descartes' view of the world, you'd have to say, well, ghosts are just part of the natural physical world. They must have some sort of location. If you can see them at all, they have some sort of shape. And if they're part of the world enough to actually put a word on it, like ghost or spirit or entity, if they are there enough to actually for us to be able to put that word on it, then it would be there enough for science to investigate it. Right? So this is kind of a separate argument that I'm thinking about. I'm personally very skeptical about claims of the supernatural, things like ghosts and spirits and things like that. And one of the reasons for that is that it ought to be amenable to scientific investigation. People say it's not because, hey, they're souls, right? And souls are spiritual entities, so they're on the other side. But you can't say that and then also say that they are manifesting themselves in physical reality. There's a ghost. If you do that, that means ghosts are a stable part of physical reality, and they would be amenable to scientific investigations, and we would know that they exist. We don't, though, right? Okay, that's my own little argument against ghosts. You don't have to believe that or agree with it. It's just something for you to think about. Okay, so that'll conclude Descartes. What I'll do is, before I move on, right, we have one more little chunk of history left, okay? We're going to look at the empiricists and then Immanuel Kant, and that'll put a cap on the history, and then we'll move to philosophy of mind. But before I do that, before I go to the empiricists, I'm going to explain a couple of concepts. I have not done this a lot, to just break down some important philosophical concepts. You've heard a few of them already, but I think it's worth it to just slow down and focus on those for a second. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording for a second, which will not affect you, but it might take me a second to switch this over, okay? So get a drink of water or something. Okay, there we go. I got it. So those first two words you've heard, right? I've used those words. The second one, I don't know why it's so difficult to pronounce. I can pronounce longer words more easily. A priori versus a posteriori. All right. And then analytic versus synthetic, and necessary versus contingent. I know these are 6 sort of intimidating looking words. The basic idea is pretty straightforward, although once you get the basic idea, then you can start to see all sorts of interesting problems. Okay, so I'll just go over each of these. So this will be a review for this part, for a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. Hopefully you already have those concepts in your head. But these these three pairs of concepts are so crucial to understanding the history of philosophy that we're looking at, this battle between empiricism and rationalism. Okay, it's very important to understand these concepts so you know where people fall with regard to any of these concepts. Okay, so a priori knowledge, it's just stuff that you can know without any particular sensory experience, right? So that doesn't make sense. The example that I always use, 1 + 1 = 2. Right? You don't need any particular kind of experience, right? You don't need to look out your window to verify it. You don't need to fly to the moon to verify it. It's not reliant on any particular experience. You can simply know that it is true a priori. And you could also know new mathematical sums are you can know them a priori, right? So maybe no one ever multiplied 212 times 375. Maybe no one's ever done it. But if you work through it and you did it right, right? There's an if there, but if you did it right, then you would know something that's true, even though you didn't have any experience of the world out there to verify it. You can simply know that it is true by thinking about it, right? So this is why rationalists like a priori knowledge. Here's another example, a basic deductive hypothetical syllogism, right? If all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then what do you know? Well, then all A's have to be C's, right? You can know that that's true. You don't even have to know what the A's stand for and what the B's stand for, right? They could be anything, right? They could be cats and dogs and fish, right? They could be wizards and dragons and unicorns. It doesn't matter. No matter what you plug in for those A's and B's and C's, that statement that I have right there is going to be true. Right? It's a true statement. If it's really true that all A's are B's and all B's happen to be C's, then all A's must be C's. It's something that you can know a priori without even checking the A's and the B's and the C's, because you don't even know what they are. So, and yet it's a statement that you can recognize must be true just by thinking. Or this one, right? Everything is identical with itself. Can you really argue against that, right? A thing is what it is, isn't it? Otherwise, it wouldn't be that thing. It would be a different thing. It seems, this is an example of what people would call a tautology, right? It's sort of like kind of an empty statement. It's like, yeah, it's true, but is that really helpful? Well, here we don't have to worry about that yet. It's just an example. It's an example of a priori knowledge. Right? Something you can know without any specific sensory experience. Right? You don't have to go verify it. You don't have to go check to see if it's true by looking at the world. That's not the way it works. Now, those are pretty straightforward, but we've already seen some other contenders for a priori knowledge as well. But they're potentially a little more problematic than those first ones. But here's one. We haven't really talked about this. This sounds right, doesn't it? Every event has a cause. At least for me, it has an intuitive appeal. Right? That if something happens, something must have caused it to happen. Or another way to put it is, there's a reason for everything. Right? Not necessarily like somebody set it up ahead of time, like God makes sure that there's a reason for everything. Not like that. I just mean there's an explanation for everything. Right? Sometimes that's called the principle of sufficient explanation. That for any fact at all in the world, there's some sort of reason that it's true. Right? So, or put it in a slightly different way, that if there's an event, if something happens, there must be a reason that it happened. There must be some sort of cause. That's not something you can know purely through the senses. You might think so, but no, that does not justify it. Your reliance on the senses does not justify that. Because all you know is that in the past you've observed lots of causes or lots of events that had causes. But how do you know that all events all over the world have causes? You don't know that on the basis of your experience because you don't have experience of all those things. Look at the future. You don't know anything about the future. It hasn't happened. So do you really know that every event has a cause empirically through your senses? No, but some rationalists might want to argue, nevertheless, you know that it's true. You know that every event must have a cause. It's not justified through your sensory experience, but you know that it is true. Okay, so people have suggested this as an example of a priori knowledge. But you could see that maybe that's a little problematic, or at least something to think about. Or Descartes' example, right? I exist as an immaterial being. He thought he could know this a priori just by thinking stuff and by coming up with these thought experiments that show that you can doubt your body but not your mind. Therefore, your body is separate from your mind. When I state it like that, it's actually a very bad argument, right? It's like saying I can doubt the existence of Superman, but I don't doubt the existence of Clark Kent. Therefore, they can't be the same person. Well, that's not right. And that's a fictional example, but you can come up with real examples, right? The morning star and the evening star, right? They're actually the same thing, but for a long time people didn't know that. So you might say, you might never have seen the morning star because you don't get up that early, right? Whatever it may be. Or you may simply think that there are different things and therefore they're not the same, but nevertheless, they are the same thing. So the mere fact that you can doubt this and not that does not mean that they aren't actually the same thing. So problematic, right, to claim that you can have a priori knowledge that easily. Rationalists sometimes are a bit too quick, maybe, to think that they've hit upon something that they can know rationally just by thinking about it. And here's another one, right? God exists. That this is an example of knowledge that's on par with 1 + 1 = 2, right? That it's the same kind of certain knowledge that you can have simply because you're a reasoning person. But you could see how those are potentially problematic cases. As opposed to a posteriori knowledge, and that's stuff that you can only know by having some sort of sensory experience, or somebody at some point must have, right? That's what we call empirical knowledge, right? Empirical knowledge means knowledge derived through the senses. Right? That's why science is called empirical. Science is not like math, that's a priori. Right? Math, you just can sit at a desk and just write notes. You don't have to go out into the world to actually get sensory information to test. That's what empirical science does. And that's what empiricists say. Ultimately, all knowledge begins with empirical knowledge. Okay. So examples, that's pretty easy, right? A scientific example, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. We know that through experience. We know that because we've built these measurement devices and then we've compared different substances and when they boil and things like that. Right? That's just one example of a pretty just regular scientific truth, right? Scientific knowledge. Come up with lots of examples like that. Things are just scientifically based. They must have done experiments and done all sorts of stuff. They couldn't just sit there thinking about it rationally. Well, if you think about water long enough, I'll figure out at what temperature it boils. No, right? That's not going to work. You need some sort of experimental evidence to get that kind of claim going, including any kind of scientific claim. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris. We know this because if you go to Paris, you can see that it's there. You can't just unpack the concept of an Eiffel Tower, right, and say, oh, it must be in Paris. No, you don't know that just by thinking about it. Or it's raining outside my house right now. I'd either have to hear the rain or see the rain, or there's a weather forecast, or somebody tells me that it is. I need some sort of information from the world out there to tell me what's going on out there. I need that happens through the senses. That's the only way to get information about the very direct physical world around you, right? It's got to start with the senses. You can't just simply think about the concept of rain in your house and then hope to rationally deduce the fact that it's raining or not raining. No, you simply need experience of the fact. Fire hurts if you touch it, right? As human beings, we have to learn this over time. These are all based on experience. It's not anything you can simply know a priori. I believe it's John Locke, one of the empiricists, brings up this example. Right? Imagine Adam and Eve, and they see a fire for the first time. Locke is saying if Adam and Eve are anything like regular human beings, they would not already know that fire is hot. That's something you come to know through experience. It's not something you could simply know. You don't have innate knowledge that fire is hot. Now, there are interesting counterexamples to that sort of stuff, though. For example, we do have instincts, don't we? Those are not quite like innate knowledge, like that you know that something is the case, but nevertheless, you know, we have certain automatic responses to stimuli in the environment, and those automatic responses might actually be innate, right? We're not exactly talking about that yet here. Here we're talking about propositional knowledge. For example, knowing that it is true that humans need water. Even if you have an instinctive desire to drink water because at some level your organism knows that it needs the water, right? You as a human being, us as a human species, we don't know that until we actually experience that, until we actually experience not having water and people dying because of not having water, right? We don't just know that by simply knowing the concept of a human and the concept of water. That's something we have to experience, to learn. Okay, so that's just a priori and a posteriori, okay? So hopefully those are clear. Now the next two are going to look like they overlap, in some cases almost exactly, with these two categories, okay? And this is what's been confusing in the history of philosophy, is philosophers did not always distinguish between these different senses, and they kind of erroneously assumed in some cases that they're all the same thing, but they're not. Hopefully you'll see what I mean once we actually look at the next ones. But you'll see for sure that here, between a priori and a posteriori, we're going to see a lot of overlap there. A lot of analytic knowledge is going to be a priori knowledge. Right? Whereas analytic truths, we have a priori knowledge of analytic truths, and we have a posteriori knowledge of synthetic truths. But as we'll see, there are exceptions to that, right? So an analytic statement is a statement that's true just by definition. So now we're defining it not in terms of how we get to know it, right? We're not doing it via epistemology, right? When we talk about a priori and a posteriori, we're talking about how do we get this knowledge? How do we know these truths? In one case, you can know them without sensory experience. In one case, you can know them without sensory experience. That's how you know them. But what kind of truths are they? What kind of truths are there out there in the world? And this has been suggested is that basically there's two types of knowledge. There's two types of truths, rather. There's analytic truth and synthetic truth. Analytic truth is something that's true just by definition. Classic example, all bachelors are unmarried. That's true, right? Do you have to go do a survey of bachelors? Do you have to go do empirical investigation? Right? Do you have to poll people? Do you have to check on all the bachelors to make sure that they're really unmarried? You don't, right? You don't have to go find all the bachelors in the world to check if they're unmarried. You know that they're unmarried a priori. If they're bachelors, they're unmarried, because that's what bachelor, that's part of the meaning of bachelor. So here's a statement that you know a priori to be true, right? It's an analytic statement. That's how you know that it a priori. That's what makes it possible to know it a priori, to know it without actually having to check the status of bachelors in the real world. You don't have to do that. You can simply know it because you know what bachelor means. Same thing with triangles have three sides, right? It's just a definitional truth. That's what being a triangle means, right? It's at least part of what it means, right? It's a necessary condition. It's not sufficient. We need some other stuff in there as well. But the statement as it is true. Triangles, by definition, must have three sides. And so it's, again, that's something you can know a priori. You don't have to go look at all the triangles in the world. You don't, to use Plato's terminology, you don't have to look at the particulars, right? If you can grasp the universal, the definition, the essence, then you already know that all the triangles out there are going to have three sides. You don't have to verify that empirically. You know it ahead of time. You know it a priori. Right? Why? Because it's an analytic statement. Right? It's a definitional truth. Your aunt is one of your parents' siblings. Right? Now, you might not have an aunt. I mean this in a definitional way, right? One's aunt is one's parent's sibling, right? Something like that. You also know that's true. So if you have an aunt, you know this is true a priori. You don't ever need to meet your aunt to verify this. But this is what an aunt is by definition. Right? It's a sibling of one of your parents. Right? An analytic truth. It's not very impressive, but it's truth, right? That's pretty good. We want to know the truth. That's what philosophy is all about. So here we've got three examples of things that are, pretty solid as far as knowledge goes, right? And how do you know them? How can you know them a priori? Again, they're just definitions. Definitions are like that. Now, what about other examples? All right. For example, I think, therefore I am, or I think, therefore I exist. Descartes used that, right? Is that an analytic statement? Is that something that's true because of the meaning involved? Maybe by definition, if you're thinking, you must exist. Is that the case? Well, I'm going to leave that up to you to think about. Is I think, therefore I exist an analytic truth? It seems to be a priori, right? If we're using the general terminology here, it does seem to be the case, right? That I can sit here and know a priori that I exist. I don't have to have experience of the world out there, right? That's what we established earlier in Descartes. I don't need to know for sure that everything around me is real. I don't need to know if this cup is real. I can know that I exist simply by virtue of the fact that I'm thinking. So on that view, maybe that's an a priori truth. But what explains it being knowable a priori? Is it an analytic statement or is it not? Something to think about. 2 + 2 = 4 is another one. The empiricists, people like Locke and Hume and Berkeley, tend to argue that mathematics is all analytic because it's just a matter of symbols that have a certain meaning, and you just combine those meanings in various ways and follow the rules and you get the results. But it's all sort of ultimately definitional. It's all constructed, it's all kind of artificial based on a bunch of concepts that we have. Okay. But other people will disagree with that. Like Immanuel Kant is going to say, no, 2 + 2 = 4 is actually synthetic. It's a different kind of statement. It's non-analytic, according to Kant, and according to other people. Mathematics, and this is still a debate. I think I brought this up before. There are mathematicians and philosophers of math and people somewhere in between. A lot of mathematicians turn into philosophers. A lot of scientists do. Anytime a scientist, by the way, writes a popular book that's directed to a general audience, they're almost always also engaged in philosophy on top of the science, right? When you have someone like Richard Dawkins writing The God Delusion, and people assume that it's a science book. It's just not, right? It's a scientist, a smart guy who knows a lot, but he's engaged in philosophy. Anyway, that's a thing to the side. 2 + 2 = 4. This is something that mathematicians still disagree about. Is this merely analytic and formal, or is it some sort of deeper truth about the structure of reality that we're grasping here in this analytic way? So someone like Plato probably would not think of it as an analytic truth because those truths are kind of empty and tautological, right? It's like all bachelors are unmarried. Okay, but this is definitional. It's not a very exciting truth. It's just sort of like blah, right? It doesn't really give us any feel like we're really understanding the nature of reality better. Whereas 2 + 2 = 4, well, that's something, perhaps. Perhaps that tells us something about the nature of reality. But maybe not. Maybe it's purely analytic. Something to think about. So as opposed to synthetic, and here I'm going to just define synthetic as non-analytic. It's the simplest way to do it. Analytic is pretty easy. It's just definitional truth. Maybe a stipulative truth even, right? Synthetic is statements are different, and you will see that synthetic statements are going to line up with a posteriori knowledge. Synthetic statements are in many cases going to be things that you only know through the senses because they're not just definitional truths. Right, so the 15th president of the United States was a lifelong bachelor. It's a true statement, but you can't know that just by contemplating the concept of bachelor or just by contemplating the concept of a president of the United States. You can't derive that a priori. You can't just know that without some sort of sensory experience telling you about the world. Well, what was the world like? What really happened with that president? What was their life like? You can't deduce any of that a priori. Right? So that's a synthetic statement because we're going beyond just the concept. Right? With all bachelors are unmarried, we're not really giving extra information about what bachelors are like. Right? For example, you might have a question. Are bachelors on the whole happier than non-bachelors or not? That's going to be a synthetic inquiry, right? Because then we're finding something out about bachelors, actual bachelors out there in the world, right? Do they tend to be happier than non-bachelors or not? That's an empirical kind of question, and the result would be a synthetic statement because we're adding to the concept of bachelor. We're not just remaining with the concept itself. Where when you say all bachelors are unmarried, you're only going to recognize that as truth if you already know what bachelor means. But that doesn't give you any informative information about bachelors in reality. Right? To do that, you would end up with a synthetic statement. A synthetic statement goes beyond merely analyzing the term. It gives us some sort of extra oomph information. Immanuel Kant called it ampulative. Right? It amplifies our knowledge in a way. It doesn't just lay it out. Analytic statements just sort of lay out the knowledge we already have to look at the logical relationships between them. Synthetic knowledge is actually new knowledge about something. So that makes it an interesting question whether or not 2 + 2 = 4 is analytic or synthetic, right? Triangular windows are rare, right? I can know ahead of time, a priori, that all triangles have 3 sides. I can't know a priori ahead of time that triangular windows are rare. I've noticed this over my life as a human being. By the way, I turned 42 today. It's my birthday. Not fishing for anything, just mentioning it here. In my 42 years, I rarely ever see a triangular window. Okay, so that's based on experience. Right? It's a synthetic statement. It didn't have to be that way, right? Triangular windows might have been really popular, but I know from experience that they're not. That's something I only know through experience, not just by thinking about the concept of triangles or windows. Thank you, Jason. So that contrasts with triangles have 3 sides, which is purely analytic. Or talking about ants. How young? I don't know. Is that young? Maybe. That's always relative, right? Anyone younger than oneself is a youngin'. Your aunt was at the zoo today. Look, I know ahead of time that your aunt is one of your parents' siblings. I know that without ever meeting your aunt, without ever seeing them, anything. How would I know that they're at the zoo today? Well, again, that would be a posteriori, right? That's something you know through the senses. And also, I'm not just saying some sort of definitional truth about your aunt that's not really that informative if you already know what aunt means. The first statement is just not informative if you already understand what the concept of aunt is. You only know that it's true if you already know that aunts are parent siblings, right? Your aunt was at the zoo today. That's something that's different. Now we're actually learning something specific about that aunt, something we couldn't have known simply by thinking about the definition, something we could only have known some other way. So you can see how synthetic tends to line up with a posteriori, and analytic tends to line up with a priori, but they don't always. Okay, we're almost done. One more concept, or a pair of concepts, and then we'll call it a day. If you're itchy to leave, you may, because we're at time, and some people have already left, but I'm going to keep going. Necessary versus contingent. Okay? Necessary, I'm going to give you the technical definition, but it's not that difficult when you think about what it means. Okay? So a necessary truth is a statement that's true in all possible worlds. That just means that it's impossible, logically impossible for it to be false. And here, well, again, it's going to line up with a priori and analytic. 2 + 2 = 4. That's true in all possible worlds. Assuming, right, we have to make that assumption that we're not just all confused about the meanings of words, like an evil demon might do to us, right? So we're putting that possibility to the side because, again, it seems as though once you allow for that possibility, you simply can't do any work at all, right? You just have to sort of give up. Like, we don't want to do that. So we're assuming now that you can grasp the meanings of terms, okay? At the very least, if we're going to communicate, we have some sort of ground rules, and one of them is, you know what 2 means and what plus means and what equals means, and you can think reasonably about these things. And if you do, then you understand that 2 + 2 = 4 is one of these things that has to be true at all times, right? So even if the universe were very, very different from what it is now, this would still be true. It would still be true that whenever you have 2 objects and you add another 2, you end up with 4 objects. You might come up with weird scenarios where maybe there's a universe whenever you have 2 objects and you put 2 together, you get an extra one. I don't think that destroys this because you'd still have those 4. You'd still have 2 and another 2, and those would equal 4. Maybe in this weird world, physically, suddenly another 5th object would appear, but that would not actually destroy the truth of 2 + 2 = 4, okay? Just so we're clear on that. So it's a necessary truth. No matter what kind of weird world you imagine, 2 + 2 = 4 will always be true. Okay? That's kind of easier for someone who thinks it's analytic to explain, possibly, right? Because it just dependent on the meanings. And if we're speaking English and 2 means 2 and plus means plus and equals means equals and 4 means 4, then we know the statement is true, right? That's the language that we're using. And if we're talking about different worlds, different possible worlds, the way the world could have been, that statement will still hold true, given what it means in our language in this world. A squared plus B squared equals C squared, right? Again, it doesn't matter what kind of world you would have lived in. If you have something that's a right triangle, then that's going to apply. That is going to be true. No matter what kind of weird world, we might have lived in Waterworld. Remember that Kevin Costner movie, Waterworld? It might have been that, right? We might have lived in Star Wars times, whatever. There's all sorts of possible ways the world could have been, or possibilities that we can imagine. Or again, imagine we could have been in a Matrix. It would still have been true that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Again, pushing aside this possibility of something simply manipulating your psychology where you can't really know anything anymore, right? We're putting that to the side. Everything is identical with itself. If you didn't like the first 2 examples, this one surely is going to resonate, right? A thing is what it is. It's not another thing. Everything's identical with itself. That's going to be true in all possible worlds. It's a necessary truth. So it's something that you can know a priori. You can know it probably because it's just true by definition. And you can know that it's necessarily true for that very reason, because it's a definitional truth. Now, the question is, are all necessary truths analytic? Are they all a priori? And notice also this necessary goes along with what rationalists always liked, right? Remember I said Plato was not impressed with knowledge like this is a cup, because that's something that's going to be false tomorrow, and it's going to be something that might not have been the case. This cup might have never existed. So Plato was like not into these temporary truths that are here in the physical world, right? He wanted things that are necessarily true, that are true no matter what, that are always true. Right? So, and he thought you could get at those truths a priori simply by thinking. You see? So how this all lines up with rationalist thinking. Plato thinks you can have knowledge of necessary truths and you can do this a priori. And that's the kind of knowledge we want for someone like Plato. Plato thinks that a posteriori knowledge can only give you knowledge of particulars, and that's never good enough for real knowledge. Knowledge has to be of something unchanging and permanent and reliable. A posteriori knowledge, Plato thinks, is not good enough for that. Right? Of course, you might say, well, with science, that changes things a bit, right? We can know things that are pretty not transitory, right? Pretty solid things. Newton's equations were true 2,000 years ago before they were invented, and they're still true today, right? Before they were discovered, rather. Right? Well, that's a whole question. Do you discover or invent scientific ideas? Well, regardless, here the idea is that these necessary truths are usually derived a priori, and that's why rationalists like that kind of way of doing things, just by thinking about it, right? Okay, almost done here. So the opposite of that is, a statement that's just true in some possible worlds. So it might be true in the actual world, right? For example, let's say there's 2 beers in the fridge. Maybe this is true of somebody out there. I have no beers in my fridge, but this could have been true, right? When I say that could have been true, right? Oh, maybe I forgot. Maybe if I check, there are 2 beers in the fridge. Okay, that statement is true in some possible worlds, right? There's some possible universe, and by that I just mean you can logically conceive of this. That's the way the world might have been. It could have turned out to be that there was 2 beers in the fridge. That's the world. It might have turned out that way. That's not a necessary statement. That's not necessarily true, right? That's more of an a posteriori synthetic statement, right? The kind of statement that Plato would not have liked because it's a particular statement, and those could always be false, or those, over time change their truth value, but also they're just not necessary truths. They could have not been true, and a rationalist wants necessary truths that have to be true. Abraham Lincoln wore a top hat. Can't you imagine an alternate timeline where the top hat never got fashionable? It was a different kind of hat, and maybe he had a fedora or something, right? It's a logical possibility. It's a contingent truth. It's not a necessary truth on this view, right, that Abraham Lincoln would end up wearing a top hat. Now, I'm just giving you these distinctions as they've been given throughout the history of philosophy. All this can be questioned. I sometimes think that perhaps there are no contingent truths at all. Okay? Sometimes, when you think about the timeless universe, right, the block universe, it's simply there, and all the changes are just these time slices, as it were. Those 2 beers that were in the fridge at that time slice is just an indelible part of this overall 4-dimensional structure. I don't know that it could be a different way. I just don't know that that's true. Right? Simply because we can imagine it doesn't mean it really could have been. Right? So there's arguments amongst philosophers. Does the fact that you imagine something mean that it's a real possibility? Or is that just something in your head? Right? So there's stuff to argue about here, but you can kind of see it. You can kind of see the point. There are 2 beers in the fridge is a little bit different than 1 + 1 = 2, right? It is at least a little bit different. So in that sense, you can see the difference. I don't have COVID, right? Hopefully, I'm living in that possible world, the possible world in which I do not have it, right? Right. There's a possible world in which Trump did not contract it. Although I don't know how many possible worlds there are where that's possible, but the same point applies for all 3 of these statements, right? They happen to be true or false. They might not have been. But that's different from 2 + 2 = 4 or the, these geometrical equations. Those things we know to be true in all cases. So this idea of necessary, really, it's not a new concept for you because we did already talk about this with Plato, okay? And so we can see that the rationalists so far like to think that knowledge is derived a priori and it's of necessary truths. Then the question is just, well, if that's the case, what kind of knowledge can we get like that? What kind of knowledge can you get a priori that's necessary? You can see why it's a little bit of a problem, because if it's just analytic, all you're doing is discovering tautologies, right? Sort of empty statements. If it's synthetic, that's a little bit hard, because most of our examples of synthetic knowledge are things that we get a posteriori, and they're almost always contingent truths. So you see how there's just, where do you locate yourself, right? Where should you be? Where are the rationalists and where are the empiricists? Now, what we're going to see is, we haven't talked about the empiricists yet, but the empiricists are much more comfortable with that right side. They think most knowledge is a posteriori, or at least starts that way, and it's many times of contingent things. Now, math and geometry are real; those do give us knowledge, but they're purely analytic. So there's no question of sort of reaching out to some sort of deep truth. Like in Plato, that we're reaching out to the realm of the forms and getting some sort of real substantial truth out there. And it's also not like Descartes, where we're grasping these truths that were put there by God. We're not doing that either, according to the empiricists. Math and geometry are purely analytic. There's nothing magic going on there where you're grasping some sort of divine essence. Nothing like that. It's just a matter of teasing apart concepts, looking at what follows from what, thinking deductively. That's all it really is. So that just to give you a taste of what's coming up, right? So Plato, Descartes fit nicely in this idea of a priori necessary knowledge. But there's this question of, well, what kind of knowledge can you get that way? Can you just get analytic knowledge when you do it that way? That's what the empiricists say. And the empiricists say, if you want real substantial knowledge, synthetic knowledge, that's the kind of knowledge we really want, you're going to have to do that a posteriori. Right? You're going to have to do that through the senses. Okay, I think we can stop there. We went over time. Thank you for staying a little late. We do have a little catching up to do. So we're done with Descartes. I have this little concept lesson. Hopefully you can get these concepts in your head and you can see how they're slightly different, but in many cases they overlap. And then you're looking at the history of philosophy through this lens of these concepts. Okay? For your final thought, I'll have you think about this. H2O is water. What kind of statement is that? Is it an analytic and necessary statement? Is it a synthetic and contingent statement? Can you know it a priori or a posteriori? How would you categorize this statement? Right? That's something for you to think about. Water is H2O. I'm just curious. So next time we meet, let's talk about that for a second, right? Water is H2O. Is that a necessary truth, a contingent truth? Is it an analytic truth or a synthetic truth? Do you know it a priori or do you know it a posteriori? Okay. Bye.
Matt, I would have took you for like 32.
What's that?
I said I would have taken you for like 32.
Oh, thank you. Well,
never mind.
It's probably the camera and stuff that adds a nice sort of a filter to everything.
Yeah.
But thank you. No, I've gotten that. I have a little bit of a baby face.
Yeah. Are you from Humboldt then?
Well, I've lived here. I went to Humboldt. I went to Arcata High for a couple of years. I went to Humboldt. But before that, I grew up in the Netherlands. I lived in Africa.
That's right. I remember you saying that.
Yeah, that's right. And then after Humboldt, I moved away for a while. I was in the Bay Area mostly. And I moved back about 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember now how long. So now I've been here for a while. So I'm kind of a native, you know, I'm pretty familiar with the area and stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, typical Humboldt. Everyone goes to Portland or San Francisco, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So we did that for a while. But then we realized we want a family and stuff, and we're both teachers. We don't make enough to live there. So we're like, where are we going to live?
Oh, for sure.
So Humboldt was actually kind of nice to come back here after being gone
Yeah,
for quite a while. I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of feels like home a little bit.
Yeah, I'm thinking about doing the same myself, man. And you know, either maybe Oregon or go back up to Humboldt. You know, it's just
Where are you?
you
now?
know, it's I'm in Long Beach.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
So yeah, you know, I lived up in Humboldt for a long time, and then I moved to Hawaii, and then I moved down here.
Uh-huh.
And you know, I'm part owner of a restaurant in Humboldt still. So